Recording in progress. Nice. Yeah, we got a good 10 people online and dozen or so more in person. This is really great. Thank you so much, everyone, for showing up and being interested. All right. So, yep. Plenty of options.
Thank you.
All right. But yes, and if anyone online wants to raise their hand at any point, we should be able to see it to answer any questions. But the way this will be structured is that the first 30 minutes will be just technical overview of what zoning is, what the MBTA Communities Act is, and what Waltham's zoning plan is. That will be discussed at the August 5th public input hearing. And then after that technical presentation, we'll have a brief period for Q&A, and then there will be a presentation by guest speaker Heather May, who is here. Well, actually, I'm just going to go to the next slide now. So yeah, first we'll be discussing why zoning matters. Next, we'll be discussing why the MBTA Communities Act exists, which is what's requiring Waltham to create new zoning. Then we'll be discussing what Waltham's plan is to comply with the MBTA Communities Act, followed by what changes we think are necessary to make it a good plan. And then after a brief Q&A, we will have a presentation by Heather May. She is a Waltham resident and a senior lecturer of communication studies at Emerson College. She has worked as a consultant in public speaking and presentation skills. She is incredibly smart, incredibly helpful, and we are so happy to have her here. And that will be how we conclude today, just so people can feel comfortable speaking at the August 5th public input hearing if you so desire, which we hope you do. So to start with, why does zoning matter? So zoning refers to local laws which regulate how we can use land in our city. So examples are there are areas of our city that are zoned for single-family residential, some are two-family residential, some are business, commercial, industrial, and some are open space. And we care about zoning because, specifically as it pertains to housing, it dictates what is allowed to be built where. And currently, Waltham has a very restrictive inclusionary zoning. So today, our goal is to advocate for new zoning, which prioritizes affordable, inclusive, and climate-friendly housing. So to start with, we want to sort of break down what is the current zoning, what is and isn't legal to build in Waltham. So here we have an array of housing types that currently exist in Waltham. We have recently built $2 million single-family home in Warrendale. We have recently built $1 million duplexes on the south side. We have currently under construction affordable senior housing at the location of the former Leland home, soon to become Leland House. We have a roughly $500,000 single family, what we now call a starter home. It's very small in Lakeview, where most of those small single family homes tend to exist. We have a sixplex on South Side, where the average value of the unit in there is about $300,000, $350K. And then we have an old mixed-use building on Moody Street, where it is first floor business and then upper floors are apartments. And basically, Waltham zoning has changed since all of these were built. And what is the case today is that the only things that are allowed to be built under Waltham's current zoning laws are the $2 million single-family home and the $1 million duplexes in our single-family and two-family residential zoning areas, respectively. The affordable senior housing at Leland House, that actually only is being built because Leland, the developers True Life, went to the state to override Waltham's existing zoning. The 480K starter home in Lakeview, that would actually be illegal to be built today, because you can see that with smaller starter homes, they tend to be on smaller lots. This lot is actually smaller than what would be allowed to subdivide today. And also this single family home is too close to its neighboring homes. Because that is normally starter homes, you have a large number of small homes on small lots, which is not allowed under Waltham's existing zoning. Waltham's existing zoning requires large lots and large setbacks from the houses being from each other. The 6-unit house on South Side, that is currently in a 2-family zone, so the only thing you're allowed to build is $1 million duplexes, no 6-unit buildings. And then the mixed-use building on Moody Street, that currently exists on Moody Street in an area where it's far denser than what is allowed. The density of that mixed-use building is actually, even though it's only 3 stories, that is 100 units per acre, which is roughly 5 to 10 times more than what is currently allowed. And then the affordable senior family home, if you're wondering what the current zoning on that is, it's currently in a 2-family neighborhood. So where affordable senior housing currently is being built, what our zoning code says is that the only thing you're allowed to build is large duplexes. So this is sort of the stakes for what the status quo is on zoning and why we want to change our zoning. So the harms of restrictive zoning, the most obvious one, as we just saw, is high home prices. Waltham makes it very easy to build the large single-family homes and large duplexes, but nigh impossible to build more modest homes. And for any apartments that go up, it's almost always the state overriding local zoning. And then Waltham also creates a bunch of commercial and lab development at a pace which far exceeds residential construction, which means as Waltham's population grows, as more people are brought into the city, the new residents have no option except to either move very far away, thereby worsening traffic, or get a place close to here, by which they are outbidding existing residents for housing. And the consequence of that is currently the median sales price for a single-family home in Waltham is $836,000, and the median sales price for a condo is $665,000. And these are the same homes that were existing and being sold 10 years ago, but because we are so supply constrained, those prices are rapidly going up. As we mentioned, another negative consequence of existing restrictive zoning is that it worsens traffic. Because there isn't enough housing for everyone who works here to live here, people have to live farther and farther away and then commute into Waltham. And it's essentially the longer people have to drive, the longer they're in the cars, the more they're contributing to traffic. And then, of course, there are environmental impacts as well, the most obvious being with all of this increased commuting caused by the housing shortage, there are a lot more greenhouse gas emissions, which is one of the largest contributors to global warming in the United States. And also there is a lot of microplastics being generated because the vast majority of microplastics in the ocean, we are learning, are actually originating as the wear from car tires. So those are the homes of the status quo. Those are the harms of the status quo, but there are a lot of benefits that come with zoning reform. Housing becomes more abundant and affordable, thereby enabling older residents who live in Waltham, if they want to downsize while still being able to stay in their hometown, they will have the opportunity. And also creates opportunities for children who grew up in Waltham. They now have abundant and affordable options in order to buy a home in Waltham or rent in Waltham, be able to stay where they grew up. It also contributes to less traffic because especially as a lot of development in Waltham is transit oriented, a lot of these new residents commute by train or bus. But even if they don't, you still have people being able to live a lot closer to where they work. And half the driving means half the traffic. Half the commute, driving half as far, half as much traffic. There are also benefits for the environment. As mentioned earlier, you get less pollution from less commuting, but also as you build denser housing, more urban infill, this also is less sprawly than traditional single-family home development, and it really saves a lot of our open space from deforestation. It's also very good for business. There is a worker shortage currently, which is largely driven by the lack of an ability for low-income workers and any workers really to live close to existing job centers. So it's really good for business because it provides a lot of workers to businesses and also a lot of customers. It also helps to improve diversity in our communities. It cannot be overstated enough how much our existing zoning incentivizes high home prices, which blocks out communities which cannot afford those high home prices. And also it allows for a more robust tax base. Because if you recall that mixed use building I showed earlier that's on Moody Street, that is actually the most revenue dense parcel in Waltham. There is not a single parcel in Waltham that contributes more to Waltham's tax base for the amount of space it takes up than that mixed use building. When you build denser, it is also really good from a revenue perspective for our tax base. So with that being said, why do we have the MBTA Communities Act? So if you're not familiar, the MBTA Communities Act is a state law that says that communities that have commuter rail access or which are near to communities which have commuter rail access need to allow for zoning districts where it is legal to build multifamily housing. So as you can see, that is a lot of towns in the Boston area, a lot of towns in eastern Massachusetts. And essentially, the reason for that is that the housing crisis is a regional problem. It is not just a Waltham problem. Every single city in the eastern Massachusetts is dealing with the same problems that Waltham has. And therefore, it requires all of us to do a little bit of something. It's not like this entire housing crisis is on Waltham's back. Everyone needs to chip in a little bit to undo their current exclusionary zoning laws and allow for more multifamily housing. So every single city and community of the MBTA communities have a different requirement based on their specific circumstances. In Waltham specifically, we are required to allow for the existence of at least 3,982 units of multifamily housing as of right. And what that means is that in a certain area that Waltham designates, if the landowners decided that they wanted to build housing to the maximal capacity, this is how much they would be allowed to build. This is not how much that will be built. This is not a mandate for development. This is simply changing the rules for what is allowed to be built should the landowners decide they want to. The newly zoned housing has to have a density of at least 15 units per acre. If you'll harken back to my previous slide, every single one of those multifamily buildings, except for the duplex, has a density greater than 15 units per acre. Sixplexes, apartment buildings, mixed use buildings, all of those are potential solutions that have this level of density of 15 units per acre or more. Multi-family zoning area must be at least 50 acres in size. At least 50% of the newly zoned area must be contiguous, which is to say Waltham can't just spot zone and choose random parcels all around the city. It has to be a self-contained district that's worked together to help create neighborhoods. At least 50% of the newly zoned area must be transit oriented, which is to say at least 50% of the new area must be within a half a mile of our commuter rail stations. And then the new zoning cannot discriminate against families with children. And the reason for that is we don't necessarily see it a lot in Waltham, although we do see it a little bit. One thing that cities really like to do is they don't want their schools growing. They don't want to have to pay for growing schools. So they only allow for, single bedroom apartments, or they only allow for senior housing as a way to discriminate against young families. So that's the other thing that MBTA Communities Act forbids. Waltham is not allowed to create zoning that discriminates against families with children. So with that being said, what happens if Waltham doesn't comply? That's not an option. This law is not optional. We will get sued by the state. We'll lose access to money for infrastructure funding. We'll lose access to money for housing authority improvements. And we will also worsen our housing crisis by continuing to impose barriers on multifamily housing construction. If you look statewide, currently, the vast majority of communities that have voted on MBTA Communities Act zoning have passed that zoning. And currently, there's only one city out of compliance, that is Milton, and they are indeed being sued by the state currently. But the good news is that isn't a concern in Waltham currently. So far, everything that's been discussed in Waltham at the city level has indicated that they plan on abiding by the MBTA Communities Act. And with that being said, there is now a plan to abide by the MBTA Communities Act that Waltham has created and that they will be putting forth in front of City Council on August 5th. Danny, if you want to take it away from here.
Hi everyone, I'm Danny. I will talk about what Waltham's current plan is to abide by the MBTA Communities Act. What the city is doing is they're creating the MCMOD, that's the MBTA Communities Multifamily Overlay District. So what this is saying is they're just taking the existing zoning code and plopping on top of it, overlaying a couple new zones where you're allowed to build multifamily housing. Specifically, this is in 2 locations near the Brandeis-Roberts commuter rail station over by Brandeis and the Waverly commuter rail station over by that kind of strip where city streets to Mighty Squirrel currently are, along with a few other industrial parcels on the other side of the commuter rail wetlands area. And so what this zoning area is saying can be built is buildings that are up to 4 stories tall or 48 feet tall with a maximum of 4 units per building. Essentially a 4-decker that's 48 feet tall. Each building can have at most 4 units and either needs to be on its own 6,000 square foot lot or must be some distance away from the other 4-unit buildings on that same parcel. Originally, the city said they have to be at least 50 feet away in the initial proposal the law department gave to the city council. Currently, as we're preparing for the public meeting next week, the city has substituted in a placeholder. It just says a distance of X feet away. Not entirely sure what the city intends to do there, but currently their initial proposal said 50 feet away. Each unit must have at least 2 car parking spaces designated for each unit. That is despite the fact that around half of Waltham households, a little over half if you look at specifically South Waltham, the zip code in South Waltham, only have no cars or 1 car. And if you look at kind of the average number of cars per family in Waltham, it's around 1.5 to 1.6. So despite only half of families having 2 or more cars in Waltham, the city is saying that if you're going to be living in this new dense multifamily housing, we think you're going to have 2 cars per household, which is even less likely if you live in a denser area in multifamily housing, things like that. So no more, getting a little bit into the technical details here, no more than 40% of the lot can be taken up by the building itself. Aside from that, there aren't any open space requirements, and there aren't any requirements limiting the amount of asphalt that could be on the lot. So you could have 40% of the plot be home, and the rest is all asphalt. As much of that kind of area can be parking as you want, as the developer wants. So the city, when they presented initially to the Ordinance and Rules Committee from the Law Department, expects this to produce 4 2,400 square foot units per building. You take 40% of a 6,000 square foot lot, the minimum size that's allowed. But that's physically impossible to build if you're also having to fit 8 parking spaces, 2 for each unit on that lot. I tried real hard and I was not able to kind of finagle it until dropping like the unit to like a 900 to 1,000 square foot unit. And then based on all of the other requirements regarding setbacks from the front and the sides and the rear, you pretty much have 4,000 square foot, like a 2-bedroom apartment, and the rest is just asphalt for a parking lot. So that's the type of housing the city wants to build here. That's kind of expecting have a single building per lot. We'll see what they've come out with kind of in their final proposal for distance away. Buildings distance away, you have developments around Waltham like Garden Crest or Charles Bank, which are kind of small apartment buildings or row houses where you have a few apartments per building and then another building a little bit away. But within those developments, they're all closer than 50 feet away. So this isn't really even as dense as something like Garden Crest or Charles Bank, which is apartments, but it's not the most kind of dense and adding as much potential housing as there could be within this land area. So to kind of look at exactly where, so this is what I was saying, the image to the left is the area by Brandeis Roberts. So that purple area is kind of where Charles Bank is. So the idea is they're creating sort of a legal designation where kind of Charles Bank as it is isn't really allowed to be built as it currently is by current zoning laws. So they're sort of legalizing it there, as well as a few office parks by the commuter rail station. And on the right side is by Waverly Station. That area I was talking about from City Streets to Mighty Squirrel on one side of the commuter rail tracks and a few other industrial parcels on the other side of the commuter rail tracks. That area also includes a lot of wetlands, which the city might be including those areas of wetland in the area that they assume a developer will be able to build in their calculations for whether they meet the requirements. So kind of going over to the next slide, in our opinion, in Wing's opinion, MCMOD as it currently sits is not a good plan. The original plan that requires 50 feet between each building makes it so that using the state the state provides these worksheets where you can plug all the numbers in that your zoning district says legalizes, and then it spits out a number saying this is how many units your plan will legalize. And taking the numbers from the city's plan, putting it into the state's worksheets, we get far fewer legalized units than the city is required to create. And as it kind of stands currently, the city, if they submit this plan, will not be compliant with the MBTA Communities Act. And as it says on the slide deck, in order to meet the requirement, there would have to essentially be no separation between buildings at all. So they're all essentially the same building. And we believe that it is impossible for Waltham to comply with the MBTA Communities Act as it currently stands by only having 4 units per building. We believe this plan needs to be rewritten to allow for more types of housing. So moving on to, we'll have Eamon come up and kind of talk about what we expect to see from the city.
All right, so it's easy to say that this plan doesn't work, but it's kind of hard to make a proposal and say, okay, what should be better? So this is the $1 million question. What changes should we demand from the city? And since it's a $1 million question, I asked Regis to help us out. So what's the best way for Waltham to modify its plan? And it's a hard question. It might be to zone it in a different neighborhood. Maybe we should be looking someplace else. Maybe we should be modifying these dimensional requirements as we hear about setbacks and building height. Maybe it's something where we need to allow different kinds of apartments, right? So this 4-unit might not work. It might be something else. Maybe we have to change the overlay district language. What I'm getting at is that this is hard. And when we go and we talk at this public meeting, it can be hard to present an idea. We might know what we want the end result to look like, but not how to get there. So just like in Millionaire, we have lifelines. And so when we talk, let's remember these lifelines to kind of help guide conversations. So first, we have the 50-50. We get rid of the wrong answers, we keep what's good. And I think that's important to remember that there are some good parts of this plan. So for instance, it's adding new housing to commercial and industrial areas, places where housing doesn't exist already. So that's great. So that there are no housing parcels that there will be fewer housing parcels that might have to get torn down and developed into more housing and may have to displace someone in the meantime. That's really great. Also, the requirement is that half of the housing needs to be transit oriented. 100% of the parcels are located by Brandeis Roberts and by Waverly Station. That isn't something that the city had to do. It's actually really great that they did this. Now, some of the parcels over by Waverly Oaks Road, by Waverly Station, they were very long and skinny. So sometimes, they were close enough at one end, maybe not close enough at the other end. So there are still some, kinks that have to get worked out there. But it's making sure that not only you say what you want changed, but also that we can say some of the highlights of the plan. All right, second lifeline is phone a friend. Basically, I'm not a zoning expert. A lot of us aren't. But let's make sure that our city is using the experts and the resources available. All right, we can hire a zoning expert to put in an economic feasibility study. This allows us to have an inclusionary zoning requirement in our MBTA Communities Act sort of overlay district. And that allows for low-income housing to be included in these buildings. And that's really important. That hasn't been done yet. But if we hire a third party as a city, we can do that. 90% of the cities and towns that are affected by the MBTA Communities Act have applied for technical assistance. There are many organizations in the state that are willing to help. And if you're not Waltham, you probably have taken them up on that. So it's a good ask to tell the city hey, there's resources available. Let's make sure we're using them. And also, finally, as we look forward and as we continue to tackle the housing shortage, housing crisis, make sure we can hire housing experts so that we have a fully staffed planning department, because the city got it wrong the first time. The next time that something like this comes up, let's make sure we don't drop the ball again. So make sure we phone a friend so that the city is getting help from the experts. And finally, the last lifeline is ask the audience. So instead of just figuring out, hey, I think this might be good, you want to try this, just go look out. We have some great neighborhoods in Waltham, so look to our old neighborhoods to help design the new ones. As we talk about a wider variety of apartments and what that would look like, we have so many apartment buildings here in Waltham. Tom, I know you showed a few of them in a slide earlier, but it's really easy to go and look at something that exists in the city and be like, I love my apartment, I love my home where I live, I love the neighborhood I live in. Can we have more of that? Instead of having to think of something that's new and strange and hasn't been done before. And as we talk about parking requirements specifically, you could ask the audience, how much parking do you actually need? The census gives us a lot of good data so that we're not just kind of picking numbers from random, we can actually use the data and see what people actually need. So as we just talk a bit about some apartment buildings, these are just some more that are around the city. Those first two up top are by Brandeis Roberts. One over here is from Felton Street, the two down in the bottom. We have one that's off Newton Street, one that is on Trapello Road, actually quite close to Waverly Station. So these are just modest apartment buildings. And as we think about what kind of apartment building, what kind of multifamily housing we want, there's a lot of great examples in the city that we can use. As we think about parking requirements, even though the parking requirements for the overlay district require 2 cars, the census average across Waltham is 1.6. And in the south of Waltham, close to the commuter rail stations, it's even closer to 1.5. And we see that in lots of modern housing, when we require parking, we have, the first story is entirely garages. We have lots of asphalt. We might have to, this in the middle, this is the new building on Moody Street, kind of kitty corner from the Common. They had to raise it all up on stilts just to fit cars underneath. Here's just a 2-family home. They both have driveways, but since they also needed a garage, once again, they had to lift everything up. So everyone has to go up and down these stairs. That's not a home that you want to, age in. Also down at the bottom here, this is the parking lot at the watch factory. 100 years ago, that used to be a park. It's often empty, and just because of parking requirements and not thinking critically about, hey, all of these people got to the watch factory in the 1800s and they didn't need to drive. But then as soon as they added that parking lot that maybe wasn't really needed, we lost 2 parks in the city. So ask the audience, look out in your neighborhoods, see what you want to replicate, see what you want to emulate, and use that as your example. So all 3, ask the audience, look to the old bones of Waltham to see what they did right. There's lots of apartment buildings that already exist. It's not something that's new, it's not something that's unknown, it's something that's in all of our neighborhoods. It's something that's really easy to point to and say, I want this, I want to be able to have more of these in Waltham. Phone a friend, to make sure that the city is using the resources and the experts available and making sure that they can hire folks on staff to be experts in the future. And finally, 50-50. Say what you want change, but also highlight the good parts of the plan, both that are presented before you, and also if other folks have a good point, echo that as well. I've seen too many plans where folks will go to a public meeting, they say everything they don't like, and then in the next revision of the plan, the few things that were good were also gone because no one advocated for those as well. So make sure you get both sides.
So yeah, thank you, Eamon and Danny. Before we move on to Heather's May's presentation for how to provide public input, I do want to give a brief amount of time. I'll give it 10 minutes maximum. People want to make use of it. If you're on a Zoom call, feel free to raise your hand. If you're in person, also just raise your hand or speak up. If you have any questions about what was just presented or questions about Waltham's current plan, the MBTA Communities Act, or zoning in general. Yes.
Are you seeing kind of other communities respond to this, and are the overlays similar to how other communities are finding a solution to this?
Yeah, so there are a lot of communities to pull from so far. Most of them, they set just a density maximum, then otherwise there's a lot of liberty with that. So a good example is our neighbor Lexington. They had 3 different designations of types of overlay districts, like a village overlay district, a multifamily overlay district, and I forgot what they called the third one, but all of these were in service of complying with the MBTA Communities Act. And as a result of that, Lexington passed theirs over a year ago now, and they have had 4 developments proposed as a result of their zoning last year. And they range from a mixed-use building with 9 apartments on top of storefronts to a 24-unit condo development for homeownership opportunities to a 200 unit apartment building. So that's a good example. Lexington did it quick. They got ahead of the curve and they're already seeing the benefits of what they did. Watertown Squares and Watertown's another one. They're incorporating their compliance with their already developed Watertown Plan Square, which is largely, I think, they're doing mostly mixed use or also apartment buildings close to the center of their city where there's a lot of bus access. And then there are other communities like Medford who were less innovative and they just legalized what was already there. Because as we discussed earlier, housing that currently exists is illegal to build today. So some cities like them or Haverhill just legalized housing that currently exists. So there's a pretty wide variety, but those are a few examples of communities in the area. Yeah, our audience member had asked if those online didn't hear examples of neighboring communities and how others have complied with the act.
I think it's also important to note in Watertown space, where Watertown is required, their magic number is they have to legalize 1,700 units. Their plan as currently proposed allows 6,000 units in their new zoning districts. They did.
So still Watertown, though, they complied by doing twice above what they needed to do, which is always an option. We can always do more. Yeah. Let me just check online to see if anyone's. Okay, I see. I'll do Diana and then you. Diana.
Yeah, I have two quick questions. One is, should we be advocating for more than just having this hearing, which is, on the one of the busy nights of the council where they do committee council, and it's in the middle of the summer, but where they have a public meeting that is more open? That's the first question. And the second one is, if you change the parking requirement from 2 to say 1.6 or 1.7, how many more units could we get? Do you know how much of a difference it would make?
So for your first question, which was, can someone remind me? Sorry.
About having community meetings, but not during a council meeting, but a separate meeting where the public gets to involve more in planning, something like Watertown did.
I think that's a really great suggestion, and I would definitely advise, if people care about that, which I think that is something worth caring about, definitely advocate for a more comprehensive planning process that involves the community. This is an unfortunate situation where Watertown spent 1.5 years on their plan, and Waltham is very quickly running up against the clock. We have a deadline of December of this year to do it. But that's definitely something worth advocating for, especially emphasizing how, hey, Watertown had a really big planning department, and that's how they were able to engage the community. Why don't we have people on hire in Waltham who are able to engage the community like that? Or also Watertown hired consultants, hired experts to help facilitate that community engagement. Why can't we also hire experts to facilitate community engagement? But yes, I think that was 100% a really good thing to advocate for, and thank you for bringing that up. And the second thing was parking requirements. And basically the trade-off is, so there are 2 aspects to how parking requirements can sabotage housing development. The first one is cost, and the second one is space. Concord, when they did their economic feasibility analysis, they learned that a parking spot can cost as little as $15,000 to build. If it's a service parking lot, it can cost as much as $75,000 per parking spot to build if it's an underground garage. So parking can get very expensive to build, and as those costs are incorporated into cost of development, those are costs that immediately go on to anyone who wants to rent a home or buy a home that is built. It can very directly drive up the cost or make the project just not financially pan out at all. And the other one is space, which is to say, the average parking spot, including egress to the parking spot, takes up like 250 square feet. So 2 or 3 parking spots that are unnecessary, and suddenly you've sacrificed the space for an entire new home. So those are 2 ways in which overly high parking requirements can sabotage housing creation and take away homes from people who need it. So you and then I will read from the chat, but yeah, what's up?
3 sort of spots here. One is design. Having the first floor be garage is actually a good idea. You can get around the issue of having multiple floors for people have to climb stairs with a carefully placed elevator. So, I mean, yes, the elevator is going to be a cost, but if you're basically rolling a cart like when I sometimes do to pick up food in places and bring it back. Having something like that is virtually indispensable. Number two, the height limitations are, I think, the number one problem. Not just for allowing mixed use, even if you have a garage on one level, you have your, but then also you have to think about maybe things like the thing with storefronts in particular is they have to be ground level, and that competes with the parking space. So unless you're doing something like a higher end underground ones, which is more excavation, that's going to be a little difficult. If this mixed use is something else, like say office space or something that can be on the top floor and doesn't require as much direct interface with people. I mean, if you have storefront place, people need to park at the store, and that just exacerbates the parking problem. So thinking about what you're going to do mixed use, what type of mixed use are you going to have is going to be a factor. And the other one,
yeah, can you be quick with this last one? Sorry, just so we can get to everything else.
It's automated construction, and like we're already at the point of where we can start 3D printing buildings reasonably well, getting from the static 3D printing models to mobile ones that can that aren't so limited in the shape or the size or anything else in the buildings they can make, would definitely accelerate things forward even further. But just being able to more rapidly and cheaply create the building will make buildings that would otherwise seem unfeasible feasible.
Yeah, I think those are really great points. And he mainly spent a lot of time, for those who couldn't hear, talking about the different ways in which we can build housing and different layouts and how they work. And I think that's also really valuable if you have ideas of what new housing can look like. Share that with city councilors, because oftentimes I think there's a lack of imagination of imagining what a future Waltham could look like, what zoning changes will look like if implemented correctly, or how you want to be seen in Waltham if it's implemented. It's very good to demonstrate to city councilors like, hey, I can imagine higher buildings. I can see these being great things. So please, let's legalize taller buildings or all those other things. So yeah, thank you. I'm going to respond to the text. Tracy, I'll let you ask your question, and that's going to be the end of this Q&A. So yeah, so please show the slide with the map skin and point out which areas will be included in the zoning change. All right, I can definitely go back to that. So if you see these maps, all the areas which are highlighted with diagonal slashes in a reddish orange color, those are the areas that are currently planned to be rezoned. So they involve the office park just adjacent to the Brandeis Roberts commuter rail station. They include the Charles Bank Estates and Gardens. They include Waverly Oaks, and they include Thayer Road and Clematis Ave Industrial Park. Once again, I think a good thing to talk about that Eamon mentioned is that it's really good that we're rezoning a lot of industrial and commercial areas because that will produce a lot of new housing. It is less as impactful that we're rezoning places where housing currently exists. So definitely one of the good things that we encourage people to talk about is how, hey, it's really good how we're rezoning industrial areas where people don't currently live. Let's do more of that. And then Mary said, or Marie, okay, the question is, and yes, the slide deck we can put on our website and also email out to everyone. If you're watching online, if you want to text your email, direct message it to my account, we can make sure you receive an email as well. And then Marie's question was how the large number of small lots in Waltham would impact the plan. So that's a great question. So basically, currently, Waltham isn't really rezoning around small lots except for around Thayer Road. So it's not too impactful, but if Waltham were to choose to focus zoning on small lots, essentially what it does is it changes the design of what needs to be legalized. So for example, a lot of what our neighboring communities have legalized is larger apartment buildings of the type we see with 40B projects. Such as what's happening on Pond Street or Bear Hill Road or Winter Street. But when you have small lots, essentially what that means is that you can allow for smaller multifamily buildings. And since there's only a density requirement, that means if you choose to focus on smaller lots, you can comply with the MBTA Communities Act with smaller buildings. 6-unit or 8-unit or 10-unit or 12-unit buildings, these are things that can very easily fit on small lots. And that is an option towards compliance with the MBTA Communities Act. I will say the one big restriction, though, is that Waltham's current parking requirements are very much not in line with the historic development pattern of Waltham. So when we have currently existing in Southside a lot of dense housing on small lots, if you throw in a modern day parking requirement, that makes that housing impossible to build because you just geometrically can't fit that many cars on such a small lot. So in terms of small lots, there's not really a big barrier in terms of housing development or complying with this law. There is a big barrier when it comes to parking minimums. And lastly, before we move on, Tracy.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I live in Carlsbad, so I was wondering why doesn't it comply with current zoning laws?
So the reason it doesn't currently comply with zoning laws is, so I'm not 100% certain on this, but basically back before 1976, Waltham had a lot more permissive zoning that allowed for a lot more higher density. Since then, Waltham has been downzoned, where resident C districts, which is what Charles Bank and Charles Bank Estates and Gardens are currently zoned as, it's a maximum density of, I actually can't remember off the top of my head.
Like you can get a special permit to go up to 18 or 20 or something.
Yeah, but by right, so I think with the special permit, it would maybe be possible to build again, but by right, I believe the limit is closer to 6 or 8 units. No, that's it. Yeah, 6 units per acre.
So the density is 6 units per acre?
Yeah, which is currently, that's half as dense as Charles Bank currently is. So you wouldn't be able to build that today. It would have to be like duplexes or 3-unit buildings. Where Charles Bank.
Is too dense by current standards, that's the problem.
Charles Bank is too dense by current standards. Yes, that is the reason.
Requirement, was that a 2-car minimum at the time?
Before 1976, I can't remember when the parking requirement changed. So the answer is maybe. I can't say for sure.
The reason I'm asking is because in Charleston almost always has plenty of parking, except maybe very late at night, so it'd be a good argument to make that we don't really need 2 cars per lot if Charleston didn't have that at the time.
Fully agree. Yeah, and if you're able to talk on August 5th, I think that's a great point to raise. There are so many places where people who live in these multifamily developments, it's very easy to look around and say, hey, we have a lot of empty parking spots. Why is this necessary? That's a very good point. Currently at Charles Bank, there are a lot of empty parking spots because presumably there were high parking minimums when it was built. But yeah, thank you all so much. That is the end of the technical portion. Now, Heather May is kind enough to give her time to speak to us about how to give effective public input. So thank you so much, Heather.
Thanks. That is a lot of information to process. So I'm going to give you the quick and dirty version of how to present yourself when you're doing especially a public hearing. The information that you see here, I'm happy to go over with people one-on-one after. Okay. So let's see here. So Monroe's motivated sequence, it's a structure for how you think about putting together a persuasive speech, okay? And the thing that Monroe's does is that it takes the psychology of how we process new information and persuasive information, and it puts the structure around that psychological process. So it makes it really effective, but it also makes it really transferable. You can do it for a 2-minute speech. You could do it for a 2-hour speech, right? Because it's just inputting the information, because the content is the part that's following along with the psychology of whomever is listening. All right, so the first thing we think about always when we're talking is how do I get people's attention, right? If you've ever spoken in front of our city council before, how do I get them to put down their phones, right? It's not just our city council, a lot of city councils do it. They're busy people, they got a lot of things to do. But what we don't want, what we're trying to persuade is for people to like check in halfway through what we're saying, right? So thinking about as I start, what do I want to tell them? Often a very like short anecdote about you and where you're living or something of that kind works really well, okay? If you are, my students always ask me like, you know, can you use humor at the beginning? I always say, I don't know, are you funny? Because if you're not, it's a problem. But you know, getting people to kind of just look up and acknowledge that you are about to speak. That's what we're trying to do in that first step. The need. Now, we would hope that the people we're talking to on August 5th understand the need. The need is the problem, but we think about it psychologically as what is hurting the people that I am talking to right now, right? We're more likely to make a change if we understand that the status quo is hurting us, right? So in thinking about, one of the things that I wrote and underlined was the revenue aspect, right? I don't know if you read recently the biotech company that is closing in Waltham. We depend a lot on our tax revenue from the industries that are, you know, along that, what is it, the 128 sort of corridor. So thinking about how the revenue streams are being affected, that's something that hurts the city directly. It hurts the council, it hurts the mayor, it hurts everybody who is working for the city, because all of a sudden that budget starts to go down, right? So if we can improve that revenue, that's going to be something that works nicely for them in the solution step, okay? Tom, you said a lot of times people go in and they say, this is what's wrong, this is what's wrong, this is what's wrong, right? So if we just focus on the need, what we end up with is people listening to us that feel hopeless, right? They're like, oh, great, so everything sucks. All right. So thinking about the solution and making sure that whatever solution you're advocating for in those 3 minutes or whatever it is that you have to talk directly corresponds to the need that you talked about. Okay, so if you talked about revenue in need, then the solution that you talk about needs to talk about revenue. Otherwise, we talk about a bunch of needs and then we talk about a solution that may or may not correspond to those needs. The people listening, I always say, like, logic is logic, but audiences, not very logical, right? So we don't want them putting the pieces together themselves. Who knows what they'll come up with, right? We want to put those pieces together for them. Want them to be able to connect those very easily. Visualization. So this is the part that most other kind of structures, whether it's persuasive essays or speeches or whatever, forget about. We have to help people envision what the future will look like, right? We have a lot of individuals on our city council who have lived in Waltham for a very, very long time, most of them for their entire lives. So what that means is that if you think about it from a psychological standpoint, thinking about a different kind of Waltham is incredibly difficult, right? It's hard to envision. Giving them something that they can see, whether it's, you know, if we had another, like Diana was talking about, a separate meeting and you could do some visual aids for them, or just painting a picture by talking about what things could look like. And we have some good examples around us that we can use to talk about those things, right? if we also think about in terms of visualization, depending on exactly what you're trying to achieve, you can go negative with visualization. You can talk about how horrible and awful things will be if we don't do this. The issue with that is that the negative doesn't last as long for people, right? We're really good at ignoring negative things, when we feel like we can't do anything about them. So the positive visualization tends to last a little bit longer in terms of persuasion, right? And finally, and this is what we were just talking about in terms of what to ask for, be specific, right? Because otherwise, who knows what it is that they'll pick, right? You want to tell the people that you're talking to very specifically, we want this, this, and this. When you're thinking about the action step, it's also helpful to think about what needs to happen next, right? Not just the end product. What do they need to do next? To me, after listening to all of this wonderful information, it sounds like we need to do some hiring, right? That could take a little while. So, I'm thinking like, yeah, we need to, like, there needs to be a job description written and published and out there like yesterday. So thinking about what is it that they need to do next. The more immediate something is, the more likely we are to get that thing done. So these are just the steps for thinking about content and how you want to arrange that content. I'm just going to talk really quickly, and so I'm going to bring all of this up. When we're thinking about our delivery, most of us don't love talking in front of groups of people, right? I have taught public speaking and debate for 25 years or so. I'm good with it, but one of the things that people really worry about is what's going to happen when I get up there, right? So number one, first, should I use notes? Yes, you absolutely should, okay? Because I know we've all been there. I know you're all here, which means you're super engaged in what's going on. So you've been to town halls, you've been to city council meetings, and there starts to be this point in time where everybody who's getting up is saying the exact same thing that everybody else has already said, right? We don't want that, because at some point in time, people start to tune out. And then when person X comes up and has something really wonderful, it doesn't matter because they've stopped listening, right? So the summarizing of, we've talked about revenue and this and that, and that's great. And then moving into what you want to talk about, which is something new, right? In order to do that, having some notes is a good idea. Keep yourself on track. Doesn't have to be extensive, but whenever I have to get up in front of city hall, council type meetings, I always want to have, I want to make sure that I hit everything I want to hit, right? Verbal delivery, slow down. Just, that's everyone, myself included. I can feel right now, I'm talking really fast and I'm starting to run out of breath because that's what happens when you talk really fast, right? So if you feel like you're trying to speed through something, we tend to talk fast. If we're a little bit nervous, our bodies, they're amazing, wonderful things, and they're like, I'm gonna help you out. Here's some adrenaline. No, thanks, I didn't need that. Now I'm like, ah. So how do we slow down, breathe? Just on your notes, I often write breathe at the very top of my notes because it just helps me calm down, think about what I'm gonna say, take a breath, and then start, okay? The mic is not your enemy, okay? It really is not. And if we think about it from the perspective of being accessible to everyone, there's nothing that makes me more angry at a meeting than somebody that says, I'm not going to use the mic. You can all hear me, right? Because now you've asked the person who's hard of hearing to be the person that says, I can't hear, right? No, don't do that. So use the mic. The only person I've ever seen that doesn't need it is Sheriff Katusian. I think he could talk at like Gillette Stadium without a mic and we'd all hear it. But the mic, don't worry about being too close. If you're too loud for a second, you're too loud for a second. That's okay. But what you don't want to be is nobody can hear me for 3 minutes, right? So use that mic. Don't overcorrect, right? You mess something up, just restate it, move on, right? And don't disclaim, okay? So what does that mean? So many of us get up and we feel a little bit nervous and we say, you know, something like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm just really nervous, right? Well, now our audience is worrying about us being nervous and it's getting in the way of them listening to us, right? So even though like that is sort of, it can be like a really compelling feeling to say, I'm sorry, I'm so nervous. Just, it's okay. We all know public speaking, not the most fun thing for most people. Most of the people getting up are a little bit nervous. It's all right, okay? As a public speaking teacher, my favorite quote is always, you know, speak your truth even when your voice shakes, right? So just, you know, put it out there. It's all right. If you're a little nervous, I think sometimes that kind of emotion behind it, especially in these types of situations, makes it even more compelling. Okay. All right, last thing. There's a whole other set of things that we want to think about, and that's the nonverbal. When people get nonverbal messages that are contradictory to what we're saying, we trust, we believe the nonverbal, okay? So what does that mean? I have a tendency when I get nervous to laugh, right? Like that's, you know, that's what I do, yeah. If I'm talking about people not having housing, if I'm talking about, you know, people with housing insecurity, food insecurity, whatever, like laughing's not appropriate, right? So just thinking about neutral, right? How can I be neutral? If you know, right, you know, you have that resting face that's, you know, a little maybe intimidating to people, just, you know, thinking about how do I just be neutral? I don't have to smile all the time, but, you know, I'm looking at like Eamon and Tom here, they've got nice, like friendly, open faces, but it's not over the top, right? That's what you're looking for, open. With nonverbals, it's always about, I want to minimize the space between me and whomever is listening to me, right? So eye contact, facial expressions, we want them to mirror what we're saying. Eye contact, we have decades of research that tells us that when speakers don't make eye contact with us, we assume that they're lying. Yeah, so it doesn't mean you have to stare at people, right? That's creepy, so don't. But it means that, you know, when you're making a point and you've started saying something and you know what it is you're gonna say, to look up and just kind of make eye contact with a few people, right? There are a few members of our city council that are incredibly good listeners and they'll give you great nonverbal feedback. And you only need to really find one, right? You find one, they're giving you like that, yeah, and it feels more like a conversation, right? And that helps with a whole bunch of things. What are my hands doing? The second we start talking about hands, I become hyper aware of my hands. If you're not a person that talks with your hands, in most of these situations, there's a podium, right? Just lay your hands lightly on the podium and don't worry about it, right? If you are someone that talks with your hands, then chances are you're probably fine. I talked about being open before, right? Like that's the big thing that you want to kind of think about is you don't want to, this is especially true for male identifying people, I find that they do this like Tom and Eamon, there you are again, just sitting there like this. But this is a barrier, right? So I want to think about putting my arms down. If I have a podium in front of me, I can put my hands in my pockets, that's fine. If there's no podium, we kind of want to avoid that because it looks like a closed gesture, right? There's some interesting things that happen with hand gestures and the psychology of persuasion. And if you want to talk more about that, I would be more than happy to do that. But fidgeting behaviors, that adrenaline, that those nerves, all of that stuff, right? All of a sudden we're like, you know, like fixing things. If you are a person that puts like keys, change, anything in your pocket, take it out before you get up to speak because you're suddenly like, you just want to be sort of still, calm, okay? If you are a person who, like me, I have layered hair and it's naturally curly and so it's constantly in my face, right? Like I tend to move it out a lot. If I'm speaking, I put it back so that I'm less likely to mess with it. It just helps you to focus on what you're doing and not on those kind of manipulation behaviors, right? And finally, I know it's on there twice, right? But it really is important to make sure that you look at people when you're talking to them in this situation, because we really don't want that feeling of this person doesn't know what they're talking about, or this person knows that what they're saying isn't entirely true, and that's why they won't look at me. So definitely, eye contact is the easiest way to make a connection with someone. It's the easiest way. I've, you know, after 25 years, I've seen this every semester in the classroom. It's often the easiest way to lower your nerves. It feels a little counterintuitive, but it feels more conversational when you're looking at someone rather than when you're trying to present, right? You're not trying to present. You are trying to connect. And that's pretty much about it. Yeah, if you have questions, if you would like some one-on-one practice before August 5th, if you want to, you know, run something by me, I'm Heather at heatherforwaltham.com, and you can, you know, send me an email. I'm more than happy to look at things, and that's also how I find out all the amazing, wonderful ideas that people have about things like this. So, yeah.
I have a question. Do you have any suggestions on talking with a mask?
Talking with a mask. So, yes, because I did teach a year of public speaking fully masked. You need to really pay attention to the rate at which you're speaking, because it's going to take people an extra second to process what you're saying, okay? You will probably have to speak a little bit louder than what you're used to, and I think most people know that by now, right? The other thing is that it will increase significantly the need for eye contact, right? Because there's no facial expression most of our facial expression is happening in our these muscles down here. So if you can't see that, then we need to think about that eye contact and really increase it. Yeah, that's a great question.
Do you think it makes a difference what type of color mask you wear? Do certain colors be more, I don't know, connection worthy, let's say, or?
That's interesting. I don't know. Yeah, it's very, I would be interested to find out about that. Yeah.
They black is kind of professional default, and the colored one is people who make a color.
Oh, interesting.
It's like more playful. It doesn't feel as heavy.
Yeah, yeah. So we're talking about mask color and whether or not it affects our the way that people are perceiving us. And one of the answers was that the white sometimes comes across as very medical, right? And that makes sense. Absolutely. Yeah. And I know when I was teaching in a mask, I had like decorated mask because it just felt more fun. Just gonna look and see. Oh, okay. All right. Thank you all for letting me talk to you. Appreciate it.
No, thank you so much, Heather. That was a very fun experience of getting to publicly speak and then get all the feedbacks. And I have a little list of ways to improve. But no, really good and much appreciated. Thank you so much for taking the time. Yeah, I hope that helps everyone feel more comfortable. You know, you don't have to be perfect your first time speaking or any time speaking. But if you want to feel more comfortable and get better, that's a lot of really good advice. So once again, thank you so much for coming by.
I never expect perfection. I only expect myself.
That's very good. That's very good. All right, that's perfect. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending. It really means a lot to have so many folks engaged and interested in the issues. I hope to see everyone on August 5th at the public input hearing. And of course, feel free to reach out if you have any questions in the meantime. We're available at win@abundanthousingma.org. We also have a website, walthampolitics.com/win. If you saw any of our events online or our flyer, it's at the bottom of the page. And of course, if you want to reach out to Heather for public speaking specifically, that's also available on the slide deck, which will be posted to our website. So yeah, thank you so much, and I'm going to end the recording right now.